Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Ananya Sinha, and I'm originally from India, but I grew up in Singapore and have lived here for 14 years of my life. I'm often called what's a third culture kid, shaped by both my roots and the place I've grown up in. Outside of academics, I'm passionate about music, particularly singing, and I also train in equestrian riding as my sport. So I've been fortunate enough to work with my mentor, Dr. Jonathan Lair, who recently completed his PhD in East Asian and European history at the University of California, Berkeley. He's guided me through this project and helped me to sharpen my ideas. I chose this focus because Singapore's post-colonial governance, this is the place I call home, and I've always kind of been fascinated by how it transformed from a small colonial trading port to a global financial hub. But as I looked closer, I realized that the story of Singapore's success is not a simple question about a break from colonialism. Instead, it's a story of continuity. So, the guiding question for my project is how has Singapore's how has Singapore preserved and rebranded its colonial foundations in education, governance, and racial management? Um, and governance and racial management. Um, and even exported as them as model for other states. My central argument is that Singapore's success is not about rejecting colonialism, but about carefully perfecting and repackaging it. What we often think of as uniquely Singaporean students, discipline, efficiency, meritocracy, and racial harmony actually trace back to British colonial governance. After independence in 1965, Singapore didn't discord these structures. It rebranded them to legitimize the new state and later marketed them as broad as the Singapore model. So, under the British governance in Singapore rested on social control, surveillance, and elitism. The colonial administration didn't try to empower the masses, instead, it created a small elite trained in English medium schools to act as clerks, teachers, and intermediaries. Institutions like Raffles institutions and early mission schools produced English-speaking elites who were loyal to the colonial system. Education wasn't about fostering critical citizenship, it was about producing people who could keep the machinery of empire running. This system of selective inclusion, where a majority gained access while the majority remained politically passive, became the blueprint for post-colonial Singapore. So, after independence, Singapore didn't dismantle this elite system, as I said prior. Instead, it kind of rebranded it as meritocracy. The Public Service Commission scholarships, modeled on British civil service traditions, created a pipeline of elite students who studied abroad and returned to govern. Schools like Raffles Institution, Anglo-Chinese School, and Hwa Chong Junior College became gateways for the ruling class. While the rhetoric emphasized fairness, access was shaped by class and language. Those who were already advantaged, often English speaking, and the wealthier families, had a head start. Sociologist Chua Ben Huat describes this as ideological work. Meritocracy convinces people that the system is fair, even though it produces privilege. In practice, the colonial idea of grooming a small elite simply continued under a new name. So another colonial legacy was managing ethnic divisions. So the British had used divide and rule to maintain order, and Singapore's post-colonial leaders also leaned on this approach. The 1964 race riots and the earlier 1950 Maria Hertog riots were used as lessons. The message was that the unchecked ethnic politics could destabilize the nation. Lee Kuan Yew often invoked these events as proof that only a strong centralized state could guarantee racial harmony. This ideology was reinforced in schools. English was promoted as the neutral common language, but this was actually advantaged to the English educated elite while sidelining vernacular schools like Nanyang University. Later, symbolic rituals like Racial Harmony Day taught children to celebrate diversity, but always under state choreography, where racial identity was acknowledged yet carefully managed. So, Singapore also manages continuity through control of history. When the British withdrew in the 1960s, they took sensitive files back to London. The so-called migrated archives, many of them contained evidence of repression and violence. Only selective records were returned, leaving gaps that made colonialism appear more benign. So school textbooks kind of often echoed this. So strikes as left-wing activism and inequality are downplayed, while the colonial rule of law and infrastructure are celebrated as stepping stones to success. As historians Kevin Blackburn notes, archives and education in Singapore serve to produce a master national narrative that emphasizes continuity and legitimacy over rupture. By the 1980s, Singapore had returned its governance system into a global brand. Leaders from China, Rwanda, and the UAE looked into Singapore's system as a model. China's Deng Xiaoping used Singapore as inspiration for special economic zones, noting how it combined authoritarian control with market openness, and Rwanda's Paul Kagame praised Singapore's efficiency and adopted similar centralized planning and elite recruitment. The UAE kind of borrowed from Singapore's blend of global finance, strong bureaucracy, and controlled multiculturalism. Lee Kuan Yew promoted this model abroad, arguing that discipline and order, not liberal democracy, were the true keys to development. What was once colonial governance became an admired template. So, what does this mean for how we think about decolonization? Singapore shows us that colonialism doesn't always have to end with rupture. Sometimes empire survives, not through force, but through administration and adaptation. Singapore's institutions, from education to racial management to historical memory, are examples of how colonial structures can be localized and legitimized. And when these structures are exported, they reshape and create a further and beyond Singapore. For me, researching this project was also personal. Growing up in Singapore, I saw the narrative of meritocracy and harmony everywhere. But through this research, I've learned to look critically at where those ideas come from and to see the legacy of empire live on, often in surprising ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya, for that thoughtful presentation and very cool research topic. I can clearly see why you chose this, being a Singaporean yourself. So I actually have a couple of questions for you. The first is, when we zoom out and look at Singapore's success story today, how much of it would you say comes from its colonial legacy versus, as you said, its kind of own reinvention?
So I think looking back, I think that Singapore, sorry, could you just repeat your question?
Yeah, of course. So when we look at Singapore's success story today, clearly it's doing extremely well from a colonial previous, story. How much of their success would you say comes from its colonial legacy versus its own reinvention?
Okay. So, to me personally, and from the research that I've done recently, I believe that a lot of it comes from a blend of both of these. So, I
Mm-hmm.
think that a lot of its starting tools came straight from the British. So, for example, sorry, I had like some points on this. Oh, yeah, okay. So, for example, the centralized civil service system was also inherited from the British, and the common law system was also inherited. And like the surveillance and policing of Singapore, so like the colonial intelligence and control systems, they're adapted almost are kind of seamlessly taken from the British and put into the People's Action Party, which is the dominant governance group in Singapore. So without these foundations, I think that Singapore would not have had the same scaffolding to launch from in like 1965. But I think what makes Singapore exceptional is how these colonial legacies were kind of repackaged and refined. So I think that meritocracy kind of played a really crucial role because colonial elitism kind of reframed as fairness, producing legitimacy rather than resent, and also racial harmony. So divide and rule became multiculturalism, which was kind of celebrated in schools and rituals. And then archives and history. So colonial repression was kind of muted, replaced with narratives of pragmatism and modernization. So I think that this recombination turned what was once colonial machinery of controls into tools of legitimacy and pride. So I think that Singapore's success story, if you stop at 1965, it looks like legacy because the state survived because institutions were already there. But if you look at decades after until now, it's recombination. So continuity alone doesn't explain why Singapore thrived while other former colonies with similar legacies struggled. It's the way Singapore kind of rebranded those institutions and exported them that it explains its unique trajectory.
Wonderful answer. Thank you for that. I'm also wondering, what do you think other post-colonial societies could learn from Singapore's experience with turning, their colonial past into such a strong modern national identity?
Yeah, so I think that while researching, so I obviously did also research about the exporting of the model of Singapore, and I think that a lot of countries are already trying to adapt Singapore's model. So I think that, but also many like post-colonial nations rejected colonial structures like wholesale. But this was often for like understandable reasons from what I've read, because it was kind of symbols of oppression. At least they thought it was, but in doing so, they sometimes lost functioning administrative or like legal or education systems because Singapore shows that retaining and repurposing colonial institutions can provide stability. So instead of tearing down how like inherited institutions, maybe ask how these inherited institutions might be rebranded or localized for legitimacy. And I think that like narrative control is just as important as the policy itself. Um, so I think that like how the story is told is more than just what it did. So I think that like at least in Singapore, so elitism was kind of framed as meritocracy, divide and rule was then framed as racial harmony, repression was pragmatic discipline. So other post-colonial states can kind of I think learn that history and archives and school curricula are all powerful tools of nation building. And also, Singapore managed to sell its model, as I was saying prior, to countries such as China, Rwanda, and the UAE. So that suggests kind of that they were kind of doing something right, I guess. So its ability to kind of recombine colonial frameworks with local political pragmatism, and even like Cold War advantages kind of helped it. And I think that these are all aspects that can be taken and used by other nations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ananya. That was a really insightful presentation.